much for joining us. I'm the co-curator of Sutra and Bible, Faith in Japanese American World War II Incarceration, which is ongoing in the pavilion side of the museum. And this program is a program that will introduce you to not just objects that we have in the exhibit that really highlight the resilience and spirit of those who are incarcerated and the ways that their faith really sustained them. But you will learn today about how individuals have dedicated an incredible amount of time and effort into not only recovering those histories within their own families, but also preserving the objects and also recording the stories. So this is a program that is about sort of how not only an exhibit like this is able to come to be, but also how an institution like ours is able to come to be. We are here because there's so many people who have donated their objects and shared their stories with us, and we exist because we believe that those stories are incredibly important to preserve for all time, or as long as time exists for all of us, whether that be sooner or later. Not to be, slightly apocalyptic, since religion is the theme for today. And I want to, before I head shift to introducing you to the speakers for the first half of our program, I want to remind you that we have, in conjunction with the exhibit, we have this companion book, which is available in our store. It's also available online. If you are not here in person, you can purchase this through our store website. And again, to make a plug for membership, if you are a member, you receive a 10% discount. So many advantages there. And also, I would like to also bring your attention to this book, which is by one of our presenters today. And she'll be talking more about the process of researching for this book, but Remembering Our Grandfather's Exile, U.S. Imprisonment of Hawaii's Japanese in World War II by Dr. Gail Okawa, is, we are running close to being out of copies because her book has been selling, but you can order copies through the website, and we'll be restocking very soon. But we would like you to also take a look at this. It's an important book that gets into the little-known history of those who were interned primarily at Santa Fe. Okay, so now that we have a very full program for you today, so I'm going to very quickly introduce our speakers. Nancy Ukai will be serving as today's moderator and leading discussions. She is well known within the Japanese American community for her work in preserving histories, and she was the director of the 50 Objects website. There's a lot more that I can say about her, but I will say that much, and please check out her website about the 50 Objects, where she goes into great detail about different historical objects that share the history of Japanese Americans. Dr. Gail Kawa, who's our first speaker, is Professor Emerita of English from Youngstown State University in Ohio. She's interested in the relationships among language literacy, culture and race, in historical, political, and educational contexts. She has published articles in national journals and collections, and has presented papers and lectures nationally and internationally. As a scholar in residence at the Smithsonian Institution in 2002, she began researching the politics of literacy, identity, and culture among Japanese immigrants from Hawaii, including her maternal grandfather, who was imprisoned in U.S. Justice War Department internment camps. And this research culminated in this book, Remembering Our Grandfather's Exile, U.S. Imprisonment of Hawaii's Japanese in World War II. So with that, I'd like to invite Nancy and Gail to come up, and we'll start the first half of our program.
Well, greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us here and out there. Many thanks to Duncan Williams Sensei and Emily Anderson for inviting me to share my book with you, to JANM and the USC Shinso Ito Center for co-sponsoring this event. This is a story of recovery. actually discovery. To begin, please allow me to start at a point of ignorance and read from an early page of my book. I didn't know that my maternal grandfather, Tamasaku Watanabe, was absent, and don't remember exactly when he appeared in my life, a tall, quiet, almost austere man. I had just learned about the imprisonment of American Japanese in my American history class as something that happened on the West Coast. And perhaps we were talking about this when she mentioned this. I was stunned. My family had never talked about my grandfather, and neither had he. I rushed home to question my parents and remember confirming this. He came back a changed man, they both agreed. And it seemed to be a closed subject at that point, at least for kids, and I don't remember pursuing it. It wasn't until decades later, in the 1990s, and years after my grandfather's death, that I found this lone photo among his internment papers, carefully stored in a trunk, in an old trunk. My mother recognized her father. Can you see it? Got it, okay. My mother recognized her father in the third row, but the location and group weren't identified. I had some suspicions due to the vigas, those wooden protrusions, that I'd seen in New Mexico, and return addresses on World War II letters to my mother. In the early 2000s, I finally had a chance to research what happened to him. So my book, Remembering Our Grandfather's Exile, is a story of several journeys. First, my search for what happened to my grandfather and how that expanded to many other Hawaii Issei internees, and that's a separate and complicated story. And second, what I learned about their many uncommon and common journeys. It took 18 years before the book was published. Although I've given more extensive talks on my findings on the broader experience of Hawaii internees, for this short talk related to the Sutra and Bible exhibit, I'll focus on my grandfather's pre-war and wartime experience as a Christian minister, brief stories of fellow Christians, and a few observations about the spiritual and ritual activities of the Issei imprisoned in the internment camps in Lordsburg and Santa Fe, New Mexico. Like so many immigrants, Tamasaku Watanabe had chosen to leave his village in Hiroshima for San Francisco in 1905 at age 22. He was baptized as a Christian there and served as the secretary of the Japanese YMCA, precursor to the Japanese Presbyterian Church. He witnessed the devastation of the great San Francisco earthquake, and that somehow inspired him to enter the San Francisco Theological Seminary to formally join the Christian ministry. Yuki, a math teacher who was educated and taught at a Methodist boarding school in Hokkaido, and started a family in California. First serving at the Japanese Presbyterian Church in Stockton, then at the Japanese Church of Christ in Sacramento. So upon immigrating to the US, my grandfather developed deep California ties. But in the early 1920s, he decided to answer the call for evangelists in the Hawaiian Islands. In October 1922, when the family was preparing to leave for Hawaii, their youngest child, 2-year-old Ernest Ishii, was killed in an accident with an oil truck. Although grieving for this loss, Reverend Watanabe packed up his family, grandma and 3 children, and they made what he called a hard voyage across the ocean a few weeks later. In December, he was assigned to the island of Maui, where he served the Wailuku Japanese Christian Church members for 12 years. There he is smiling in the top row. And as an ordained minister, attended professional meetings. He's smiling again. These are kind of treasured photos because he didn't smile too much when I knew him. In 1935, he was transferred to the island of Hawaii, or the Big Island, to serve plantation workers as the Ola Japanese Christian Church, a remote area on the Hilo, or the east side of the island. During this time, the Japanese consulate appointed him to serve as a toritsugini. That's an honorary, unpaid subconsular position, to assist immigrants with the official government records and reports. It was at his parsonage at the Ola Church that he was seized and arrested on December 7th, 1941. In his weathered pocket diary for 1941, my grandfather's last entry on December 7th ironically reads in English, "Legend of the Wingless Birds." Presumably the title or reference point of his sermon for that Sunday morning. Whether he actually delivered the sermon or not, I have no way of knowing. But the vivid image of wingless birds became a strong metaphor for me. Spending months in the National Archives, I found some key documents. The warrant, for example, shows that rather than for a crime, and I've tried to mark it a little bit in red parentheses, he was arrested on suspicion of being an alien enemy. And although this sounds sinister, this was an immigration status. Due to anti-Japanese immigration laws and attitudes, the Issei, who of course were Japanese immigrants, were outlawed from US citizenship and remained aliens. And when war was declared, their status changed immediately from alien to alien enemy as established in the Alien Enemies Act of 1918, as you see in the very bottom. Other Christian Issei were also arrested on that fateful Sunday. Naojiro Hirano had immigrated at age 16 in 1908 from Shizuoka, Japan, serving as a plantation worker on Oahu and Hawaii, then a ranch hand before moving to the Ola'a plantation. Here he worked as a clerk for the plantation store and studied English at night school. On occasion, as he walked past the local Ola'a Japanese Christian church, which coincidentally became my grandfather's church years later, he heard hymns being sung and was so moved by the music that he became a Christian himself. He served as the assistant manager of the Ola'a plantation store before he opened his own Hirano store in Glenwood in 1917. Becoming a leader in his community, he taught at the local Japanese language school, as well as spoke at community gatherings. And because he was literate in English as well as Japanese, he, like Reverend Watanabe, also served as a toritsugine, helping those in need with their official paperwork. His reward for his level of literacy and humanitarian service, like Reverend Watanabe, he was arrested on December 7th, and both were sent to the Kilauea military camp. We have an illustration sketch by George Hoshida, which is in the Janam collection. Teichiro Maehara was from a village in Hiroshima Prefecture, like my grandfather, and had immigrated to the islands in March 1904 to start a Japanese language school on Maui. He and his family eventually settled in a home next to the Pu'unene Japanese school, where he was the principal, and lived across the street from a congregational church that provided some assistance to the family. That relationship inspired Mr. Maehara to become a Christian himself. Becoming a leader in the Maui Japanese community, he was appointed as a Toritsugenin in July 1941, so that he greeted Japanese dignitaries and sailors visiting the islands, and like Reverend Watanabe and Mr. Hirano, assisted less literate Japanese workers with their official paperwork. He too was arrested on December 7th, detained at the local jail, then transferred to the Haiku military camp. One observation I've made is that Japanese Christians, like my grandfather and Mr. Hirano, made an effort to develop their English literacy. This bilingual ability often led to leadership roles in their communities in an English-speaking society. Sometimes the Japanese consulate appointed them as subconsular agents or toritsugini, ironically making them primary targets of the FBI. What I've also learned on my research journey is that these Issei arrests and their internment were not simply a reaction to Pearl Harbor, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, but were well planned and thought out quite early as a part of an agreement by the Department of Justice and the War Department in July 1941. This was quite a shock to me. So this was distinct from the WRA forced evacuation from the West Coast 8 months later. So on December 7th, 1941, that day of many infamies, many Issei men in Hawaii were suddenly arrested and taken from their families. The Department of Justice, especially the FBI, collaborated with the US Army and targeted mainly community leaders in Hawaii. Some of you undoubtedly know that this happened with Issei men from the mainland. Fathers and grandfathers disappeared, beginning on December 7, 1941, over 2 months before EO 9066. Another government document that I found in the National Archives reveals a basic suspicion of Japanese Christians. While government officials were apparently suspicious of the Japanese in general because they saw them as slow to assimilate into American society, the official view expressed in this Office of Internal Security report reflected a clear mistrust of the Japanese adherents to Christianity, as though Caucasians had proprietary rights to this religion. And I'll just read that brief section of the report. There's even been found some Christianity among the alien Japanese, but whether this is a sincere adoption or not is hard to tell. It may be that Christianity has been adopted by some of the older aliens, chiefly for business reasons, or to enhance their social position among the Caucasian elements in the community. In Reverend Watanabe's hearing, held in February 1942, so several weeks after he was arrested, the interrogators asked repeated questions about his thinking as a Christian minister on matters of Japanese government and military actions, insinuating that his faith was insincere. One interrogator kept asking him repeatedly which side he wanted to win, then admitted that it wasn't a fair question. And I read other hearings where the same question was asked. The hearing board, or the interrogators, concluded first that the internee is a subject of Japan, second, that the internee owes allegiance to Japan, and third, that the internee's activities have been pro-Japanese, though not necessarily anti-American. And they voted 3-1 for his release. But he was sent to the Honolulu immigration station where they took his mugshot. He was 59. Then sent him to the Sand Island internment camp, where the order for release was reversed by the intelligence board. the Army, you can see the signatures, the Army, the Navy, and the FBI. It appearing necessary, you can see this at the very bottom of the image. It appearing necessary, it is ordered that Tamasaku Watanabe be interned. And as an English teacher, that passive voice clearly hides responsibility. So there was some kind of reason for that, I suppose. So he and hundreds of other Hawaii Issei were interned, not for specific wrongdoing, but it appearing necessary. Then they were exiled. Due to convoluted political reasons, which I describe in my book, nearly 700 prisoners were shipped to the mainland, and the lower map here gives you an idea of some of the routes that they were taken on. They were sent on 10 transfer boats at different times from the islands, beginning on February 20th, 1942. And this group of men, which I found in a photo from the Santa Fe internment camp, I finally gathered were men on the same transfer boat as my grandfather after several family interviews. There was no labeling on the original photo. So this was transfer boat 3 shipped out on May 23rd, 1942, and this is my grandfather among them. And they were sent to Angel Island up north. And I've wondered how my grandfather, at age 59, felt returning to San Francisco as a prisoner at Angel Island when he had left California for Hawaii with his young family in 1922, a free man, looking forward to his third ministry in the islands. His itinerary shows that they were imprisoned for 10 days at Fort Sam Houston. And this gives you an idea of the military camp with the Army tents. They were in the first 6 rows of Army tents in 100-degree or over 100-degree temperatures. So this was, as I said, an Army camp, and then they were sent to Lordsburg, which was also an Army camp. And we only have George Hoshida's sketches to show us what the camp looked like. They were there for a year. They were there for a year, and it was here that Reverend Yoshiaki Fukuda, a Konkokyo minister, and my grandfather, a Christian minister, and Reverend Hosho Kurohira, a Buddhist priest, submitted a multi-faith petition that redefined the concept of family in Japanese terms for the government. So the government had basically defined the family as a nuclear family, and this petition insisted that the Japanese concept of family, which was much broader, be considered in terms of who would populate, who would be allowed at the Crystal City, Texas camp. So this was a very important collaboration, multi-faith collaboration. In June 1943, Issei internees were transferred by train from Army camps like Lordsburg and Camp Livingston, Louisiana, to Santa Fe, New Mexico. This is a painting by Reverend Matsuura, whom I interviewed, of the Santa Fe internment camp. This was run by the Immigration and Naturalization Service and the Border Patrol, so the DOJ side of that agreement that went back to 1941. They were there from June 1943 to October 30th, 1945, and I verified the location and content of my grandfather's mystery photo. So this was Reverend Watanabe with his barracks mates, Barrack 64, and Mr. Maihara was among his barrack mates. He was shipped out on the 5th transfer boat somewhat later, but he ended up also at Lordsburg and Santa Fe. Mr. Hirano, as you can see, was actually on the 2nd transfer boat, and he went from Angel Island to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, to Camp Livingston, Louisiana, and here he is at Fort Missoula prior to being sent to Santa Fe. So again, the lower map shows that was one of the routes. There was one route for transfer boat 1, another one for transfer boat 2, another for transfer boat 3, and so on. Now, I asked how my grandfather may have felt returning to the mainland as a prisoner. One of my greatest regrets is that I'll never know, really. However he may have felt, he seems to have persevered largely due to his faith and sense of duty. Even at the Kilauea military camp where he was first imprisoned, he tells his interrogators, about 65 brothers come every afternoon, and we study in the Bible. I offer prayers. So that was right after he was first arrested. His letters to my mother reveal how central his Christian mission was to his very identity, his very life and sense of purpose. In some, he cites Bible verses and seems to be developing a sermon. A 1943 roster at the Santa Fe internment camp lists him as the chairman of the Santa Fe Christian Church. So I know that he assumed a leadership role soon after arriving in Santa Fe. This cross was used for services in Santa Fe and is in the gallery in the museum here. It was used for services in Santa Fe, and among his internment papers are notes for such services. Sermons described in my book. This is another view of the cross and shows that he identified it as his own somehow. I don't know if he made it himself or if someone else made it, but he did inscribe his name there and dated it as August 1st, 1944. So that was a year after they were sent from Lordsburg. Here's a set of aphorisms which he copied, I assume copied, or may have written himself, I'm not sure, and translated. I'm really on the path. 1, if I always look for the best in each person, situation, and thing. 2, if I forgive everybody without exception, no matter what he may have done. And if I then forgive myself wholeheartedly. And 3, if I regard my job as sacred and do my day's work to the very best of my ability, whether I like it or not. So there's a human element in this set of aphorisms. And again, I don't know if he made them up himself or not. But they also wrote Christmas plays like this one, An Evening in Bethlehem. And of course, there were funeral services. In this case, he was one of the officiating ministers. I suppose he's in the front row. And I identified Mr. Maihara in the second row, I believe it is. Mr. Soga, Yasutaro Soga, in his memoir, Life Behind Barbed Wire, mentions Reverend Watanabe officiating at services for Nisei's sons from Maui, who were killed in action in Italy and France. More generally, however, the Issei prisoners from Hawaii and others did everything they could to survive and resist the oppressiveness and loss of control of wrongful imprisonment. They marshaled their Japanese values to take back that control, to maintain their cultural and personal equilibrium and balance. For example, gaman, everyone knows that word. Stoicism, internal control, dealing with adversity with dignity. And shikataganai, which in this context was a realistic recognition of circumstances and an attempt to cope with them. They also used negotiation and the Geneva Convention, but these were their Japanese values. Mr. Hirano, whom I referred to earlier, referred to the mind-numbing monotony of an interminable imprisonment as barbed wire disease. He writes, "It has been said that an internee is most likely to succumb to the discouragement and depression known as barbed wire disease. To keep myself out of the disease, I am participating in many activities at this camp." One internee referred to the Issei group, what I refer to as the immigrant intelligentsia, as a cultural heaven. And in this letter to my mother, he wrote the following about the things he was learning, his opportunities for learning. "Every Sunday, a different minister takes the pulpit and delivers a good sermon, so I can get many instructions from various standpoints. Also, there are other religious sects holding their meetings according to their principles. So I'm learning many things which I can never meet again in my life, perhaps." To understand Mr. Hirano's many activities, I borrowed a template of a psychologist named John Laffin, who describes how long-term captives often employ universal human strategies to cope with the deprivation of freedom and the malaise of boredom. Strategies that the internees adapted to their culture and practices as Hawaii Japanese. And these are just some visual examples that I'll run through. So the physically creative involved art, painting in Japanese and Western styles, plating, rock, wood collecting and polishing, that was a big deal. Making and playing the shakuhachi. The physically active strategy, of course, involved all kinds of sports. Specifically, we have examples of sumo, baseball, and the theater. They were quite active in theater performances. The intellectual, of course, was a highly popular strategy, writing letters, memoirs, journals, and so on. My big surprise, the big recovery with the theme of this session, and this is a brief story in the Sutra and Bible book. His letters revealed my grandfather's involvement in my birth and earliest years. And I had no idea about this until I read his letters. So that's one of the nice things that I found out. The imaginative strategy, composing poetry, plays, and calligraphy, and so on. And the spiritual strategy was involved services and ceremonies, and due to the many photos I found of smaller and larger gatherings, I added this to the strategies list as being very significant to the Japanese internees. So you have photos of Japanese men in the Japanese community of different faiths. This photo is of a Tenrikyo memorial service, probably for Reverend Kinzaimon Odachi from the Big Island. And the Christian service I showed you before. This is a really iconic photo in New Mexico because this shows a son in military uniform who was brought to his father's funeral. Nizo Nishizaki was from the Big Island, and his son Ogden was brought in And you have all of the Buddhist ministers in their robes surrounding them. But it was iconic for various reasons that I do explain in the book. Finally, on October 30th, 1945, Reverend Watanabe and some of the same men on Transfer Boat 3 were left Santa Fe for Seattle, Washington, by train, and were shipped back to Hawaii from Seattle on a military transport in November 1945, 3 months after the war ended. I learned long after their deaths that my grandmother had made the comment that my grandfather was a changed man when he returned. So although he resumed his job, his ministry, it'll remain a mystery to me how he was personally before he was imprisoned and how he had changed, except for those smiling photos, those 2 smiling photos I showed you earlier. Not until 1988, long after Reverend Watanabe and many of his fellow internees were gone, did the US government exonerate the American Japanese and apologize for the injustice done to us during World War II. That only happened thanks to the tenacity and legal activism of their children and grandchildren. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988 was signed by President Ronald Reagan on August 10, 1988, stating that wartime imprisonment was motivated largely by racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and the failure of political leadership. As much as thousands of Issei and their American Japanese families wanted to forget those war years in order to survive and move on, this raises questions of remembering and forgetting, expressed by Mr. Soga in this poem written during his internment. When the war is over, and after we are gone, who will visit this lonely grave in the wild where my friend lies buried? Who will remember him, them, their imprisoned presence, and how? It took 60 years, but a historical marker was finally dedicated in 2002 to say that there was a camp here and to mark the fact that this happened in history. And this inspired my feelings of, I was lucky enough to be there. I had been invited as a beginning researcher. I just started this project. But this inspired my feelings of deep responsibility to learn and tell this Issei story of social injustice and social justice. And this came full circle last April with the 20th anniversary symposium and pilgrimage. I've been so encouraged by efforts to document this Issei story. The New Mexico JCL's Confinement in the Land of Enchantment project was just getting started, the second one on the list there, was just getting started when we commemorated the 10th anniversary of the marker dedication. But I wanted to leave you with Mr. Hirano's words because they seem so pertinent not only for then but for now as well. He wrote this letter to his family in 1944. Opportunities for peace never come accidentally. So leaders must take this in all seriousness and make it happen. They must cleanse the wrongs of the past and take to heart the sacrifices of the people of the world. They seem to not listen to the voices of heaven, however. We know that in order to create a peaceful world, they should. The time has arrived to move forward. Many people have sacrificed with their lives and left this world. It is my hope that we can place our faith in leaders of a new era in a new world and pass the torch to the new generation. Only then can we welcome a new spring with hope for peace for mankind. So today, this is our inheritance. Today, we can and must remember them, the Issei, and the injustice they suffered, as well as the peace and justice they wished for, through pilgrimages, informal and formal, events, and research. For only we can bring meaning to such memorials. Their legacy is in us and for us to maintain and act on. Thank you.
I love the fact that your title of your book is Remembering Our Grandfather's Plural Exile, because I know that many of you in the audience also probably thought of your own grandparents. And the Issei men, also, we talk about the Japanese-American prison camps during World War II, but the sense that it was all men that you talked about really solidified the sense that these were prison camps in this single-sex situation. You did 18 years of research, and your document is so personal, but will also help others recognize their ancestors. And I'm wondering, through all your archival work, is there one document, photograph, artifact that really remains a touchstone for you?
Well, I guess, is this? Okay. I guess the first thing that actually got me going is the photo that I showed. But there were other photos as well. The photo that I found of what I figured out was the transfer vote members, the members of his transfer vote. That also, those two photos really stood out to me. But there were all these other stories and documents as well. And one of the documents that struck me or shocked me was finding the government list of Issei men who had Nisei sons in the military. And I discussed that at quite great length in the book and tell the stories of some of those men who lost their sons. But that was an emotional response for me, so that I found that digging in the archives, even though it got fairly tedious at different points, it unearthed some very significant material for me personally, and I think also for others.
So this Issei list was actually of Issei who had lost Nisei sons in war.
No, it was a government list that listed the Issei who had sons in the military. It was an 11-page list of 161 Issei who had 200 plus sons, so there were in some cases 3 and 4 sons from one family. And there were a number of sons who were killed in action, so I tried to develop another sort of an offshoot project where I tried to understand what happened to them. And I ended up going to Europe to sort of follow the battle path.
And you do talk about one story of an Issei man whose Nisei son was killed by a Japanese soldier, which was a double tragedy you describe.
Yes.
That he didn't die in Europe, but he actually died by...
Yes, he was the eldest son in the family after the first son passed away. And his father was from a samurai family, and he was very strict, taught the children kendo and Japanese, of course. He had his own, he was the principal of a Japanese language school. But he was also an American kid. He played guitar and ukulele and sang and so on and so forth. But he was drafted, and he ended up in the MIS. The Army recognized his Japanese language skills, and so he was moved into the MIS from the 100th Battalion and served in the Pacific.
We've been immersed in all of your documents, but one thing that really sticks in my memory in your book is your description, because you do talk about your unsmiling grandfather, but you do talk about a Spam sandwich you made for him. And as a child, he smiled. Can you explain that?
Yeah, well, as I pointed out, you know, the images of him smiling are sort of few and far between, but when I was in the 5th grade, I had to stay home from school with a cold, and so I made Spam and egg sandwiches or something like that, and he enjoyed it. Now, I don't know if it was because he had Spam in camp, which was probably pretty common, but anyway, he enjoyed the Spam sandwiches, and he said, I should open a sandwich shop.
So that's maybe the next chapter for you.
Yeah.
So we're really short on time. We could talk to you for another hour. But I guess I was struck by the fact that his sermon, which he may not have given, was called Legend of the Wingless Birds. And he wrote this in English on December 7th, 1941.
Yes.
Do you feel that he regained his wings?
I think he did. That's an interesting question. Because as I said, you know, the wingless bird image was kind of a metaphor for, or became a metaphor for me of, well, you know, like a bird with clipped wings, right? I think the Issei as a group, but certainly individuals, and he, I think, was one of them, persevered, you know, because of their values and their faith. And so that was very inspiring to me. You know, the whole gambate idea is kind of, you know, is an underlying principle as well for me.
Well, I highly recommend that you read this extremely nuanced, deeply described book that Gary Okihiro, the historian, calls a memory narrative. And there's so many little grains of information. You talk about a man who fell overboard. I thought, what happened to him? Who was his family? You talk about someone who tried to commit suicide, and there's just a lot of grains in here that really resonate. And thank you so much for writing this book and for being here today.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your questions. Really.
So thank you very much for coming today. I'll just be really brief because we have so much to cover. And the first slide you see here is some of the artifacts that are in the Sutra and Bible exhibition. You've seen the cross that Dr. Okawa just described in her lecture, and the other 3 images you'll hear about right now. So keep your eye out. And then the next slide. Okay, so I just mentioned that what you see on this slide here are privately published family histories on the top, and I just wanted to encourage family historians and people who are not necessarily professional writers, but you love your family, you want to preserve your history, to consider publishing it privately, even if it's just a few issues. And the first book on the left was written by John Fuji about his parents, Kurasaburo and Kikuyo Fuji, Issei in Berkeley, California, who started a cooperative laundry, really quite interesting how they recycled the ofuro water in different ways. The second book is called Aiko. It's by Laura Morris-Williams with Aiko Tanaka Ebihara. Very interesting story. If you are interested in these books, contact me later. My 6 years of internment, an Issei struggle for internment by Reverend Yoshiaki Fukuda, who was mentioned in Gail's previous presentation. It was originally written in Japanese and translated into English. The next book is called War Historia, the World War Internment of a Buddhist Priest, about Issei Shoho Fujie. And this was written by Thomas Edwin Woodhouse, also in Berkeley, about the father of his wife, Kikuyo. And she was she didn't know very much about her father, who was a Buddhist priest interned on the mainland. And he did this very fine-grained history. And then finally, you all may know Sam Mihara, The Life and Times of Sam Mihara, which is recently published. So just to encourage you, the book at the bottom, which is also out in the lobby, is called The Book of Insignificant Things by David Izu, who's the art director of 50 Objects. And he went around his home and found various artifacts and things which were insignificant but important to him. And that's another way to interpret your family history. So today, we're going to have 3 presentations, PowerPoints by Mitch Homma, Elizabeth Nishiura, and Laura Dominguez-Yon. We'll start with Laura, whose great uncle was trained in a Buddhist monastery and then converted to becoming a Salvation Army captain after a motorcycle accident. You want to start, Laura?
Okay. That's me. Next. Next. This is great. So, Masaoki Taji was my uncle, my dad's half-brother. Again, as Emily said, he was born in Japan. He had an exquisite opportunity and education being raised in a Buddhist monastery. And so the monks were his trainers. So he learned discipline far better than many of us will ever have to exercise. And this is to encourage you to think of your family members, someone you loved, someone you didn't love, someone who was maybe on the other end of the family. Find out their stories and find out about their lives. Next. So the captain was posted in Arizona, and pasted in the inside cover of his first Bible, he has this newspaper article that celebrates the fact that in 1935, he was serving as the head of the very large Oakland Salvation Army Corps, and he had to speak to large groups in English and in Japanese, and he thought, I need a dual language copy of the Bible. So what he did is he got the existing Japanese language Bible and painstakingly by calligraphy wrote on blank pages that were bound in his English Bible, so they were face to face. It took him 10 years, and this article inside talks about his toil, waking up at 5 a.m. every morning and working till noon. And it required that great discipline that he received from the monks, for sure, to do that. Next. There we go. Here's a peek into some of his work for us to see a little bit about his artistry and also how he interpreted this Japanese vision. As we look at this, we can't really see it clearly, so I enhanced. Let's take a look on your right side in the center. There's an image of a man who sort of looks like he's got a samurai helmet on, and then the bottom is a dragon and some fire down here. So next slide. We see, oops, wrong corner. The top left corner tells what this slide is about, the paths to heaven, several paths to heaven. And in this map of paths to heaven, he has different paths indicated by different numbers and different ways of identifying those numbers, those pathways. Okay, next. So back to this one, what we just saw is the top left corner, and now we're going to look at the right side, the man. Next. There he is. I took the Bible to Wesley Methodist Church in San Jose and asked Reverend Yamamoto, Hajime Yamamoto and Reverend Keith Inoue what they can make of it. And they looked at this guy and they thought, and they looked at the maps and they go, oh, this is St. Peter. Now, how many of you imagine St. Peter looking like that? I certainly didn't. And then on the bottom right is the picture of hell and what we want to avoid and people burning in hell. But you notice there are arrows pointing the path out of hell to salvation. Next. Back to this, I want you to notice on the left side, the star in the middle. It has an arrow pointing down. Next slide. it points down to what is a timeline. And I talked to a woman who taught Sunday school to immigrants, second language. She said, if you're teaching the Bible to people who are not aware or have no knowledge of Western culture, you need to give them a context of the story you're telling them. So she called these 2 pages an infographic. And she was so excited. She wants to have copies to help her and her students understand better. And she was just so excited to see this. So we've got Tower of Babel, we've got the burning bushes, the star over Bethlehem, we've got Calvary with the 3 crosses, and we've got the resurrection in this very simple timeline. Thank you. Next. This is what she calls an infographic. Whoever thought of infographics back then? Next. 1920, here's what they looked like. I wasn't there. My dad's the guy in the white shirt in the front. He was 5. His oldest brother doesn't look like he belongs in this picture of this time period, does he? I call him California's first hippie. He was a music teacher. He was an artist. He was unconventional. One of my cousins said her father said that he was sent to the Salvation Army to straighten him up because he wasn't doing traditional things. The general story that we heard is that he was in a motorcycle accident, and the person who found him was a Salvation Army person and stayed by his side every day while he recovered in the hospital. So in 1925, he joined the Salvation Army. His brother said it was very embarrassing. His dad sent the brother to accompany him, make sure he was safe, and the brother had to stand there playing the tambourine. He was not happy about that. Yeah. He was one of the oldest of 10 kids. There were two or three of them died in infancy that we know of, and the others, his brothers called him Frank, and so the brothers' wives also called him Frank, so our cousins called him Uncle Frank. Next picture. My mother said this was their wedding picture, the captain and his wife's wedding picture, and let's see. Here. Where am I? Okay. He wanted to get married about 1935 to 38, late 1930s. The only woman available was in Japan, that was Yuko Tsurura. And so they agreed to get married. She was on the boat coming to America to meet her husband, future husband. It happened to be December 1941. And just before the boat reached the coast, they were commanded to turn around and go back to Japan. So they did. And unfortunately, she was prone to extreme motion sickness. So it was a terrible trip. She went back to Japan. Next picture. So years go by. Can you imagine 15 years? And meanwhile, my parents came out of the camp at Poston, went to the hot springs. They arrived with 2, they left, they stayed 10 years and left with 7 of us. I'm in this picture, it's one of the few baby pictures I have. I'm in my dad's arms, also known as blankets. My siblings don't like that I share their childhood pictures, but I think they're great. Yeah. Next. So that was a picture of my Uncle Roy, my mom's brother, and Aunt Kaya, my mom's sister. So when you have an aunt and an uncle, and your mom calls them Charlie and Edna, you would call them Uncle Charlie and Aunt Edna, right? So as I mentioned, my dad called his brother Frank. He and his siblings and sisters-in-law called him Frank. And my mom knew him from age 7 when he was her first Sunday school teacher. So she had great respect for him. Now, he was called captain in part. The story we heard is when the war broke out and the Japanese were being evacuated, the Salvation Army wanted to protect the captain from doing that and transferred him to Boston. But he was concerned about the congregation he was leaving. He said, "Who's going to replace me?" And they pointed to a Caucasian man. "Does he know Japanese?" And he said, how can you do this to newly converted Christians? You need to give them someone who can speak their own language. So he refused to leave. The story says he removed his collar and he said, I won't go. And they said, you are defined in direct command. And if you leave the Salvation Army, you cannot use the word captain because that is a rank in our organization. His response was, every ship has a captain. Every sports team has a captain. I am the captain of my people. He was sent to Santa Anita, and there was a story of the evangelist, Stanley Jones spoke at Santa Anita. He mentioned a verse about the eagles, that we Japanese must be like the eagles flying above the storm. Consider this your storm and do not be destroyed by it. We thought it curious because when we first opened the Bible and saw some of the illustrations, there was a sticker of an eagle. And in several other places in Nancy did show a picture with an eagle on it. And I ran that past Reverend Duncan Williams, and I said, could this possibly have been an influence? And he said it very possibly could. I read through the Santa Anita newsletters and found articles that corresponded announcing the existence of a convalescent home hospital at Santa Anita where the captain was in charge. And then the next page was the article about Stanley Jones coming to speak there. So we don't know those are answers, but we're opening up to more questions. The more questions we have, the more possibilities for answers we have. Okay. I'm in this picture too. I must have grown because the blankets are bigger. And to get revenge, I guess, or to absolve me of the guilt of showing my siblings' pictures. We have the last picture, next. I was born in April of '52. My auntie Yuko arrived 5 days later, and 4 days after that, they were married at their Hot Springs. This is their wedding picture. When my mom first said it was their wedding picture, I thought, who wears black at their wedding? Then when I discovered their marriage certificate and found out that they were married at the Hot Springs and the dates they were married, I thought, oh wow, this is more special. And that isn't just a wedding gown, that is her officer uniform. So this is more special to me now. She did call me her, she referred to me as her baby. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. We'll have time for questions and answers later, but we're going to keep moving on. And I'd like to now introduce you to Elizabeth Nishiura. We're so pleased she came here to be with us from Chicago. And I'll just mention that we aren't doing more elaborate introductions because you can hopefully go to the website, but I'd like to say that Elizabeth is the granddaughter of Shinzaburo Nishiura, famous woodworker, and we'll be seeing his work now.
Thank you, Nancy. First slide, please. Thank you. I'm so tall. You have to shift the screen up. So this is the Nishiura brothers. If you go into the exhibit, you will see a large altar that was built in Hawk Mountain, a Buddhist altar, and it was built by the Nishiura brothers. That's Jintaro standing and Shinzaburo, my great-grandfather, seated. And they founded the Nishiura Brothers Construction Company in 1910 after immigrating from Japan. And then next slide. So one of their first major constructions was the hospital in San Jose. That's it, under construction. And then a couple decades later, the gate at the Hakone Gardens in Saratoga. Next slide, please. And then this is the Buddhist temple in San Jose, California, under construction. And then that's my family in front of it. That's my great-grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, my grandmother, and the kids, including my dad, who's the somber one in the middle. And most of this information that I have is actually research that he and his brothers have done. So the next slide, please. So this is the Japanese pavilion at the World's Fair before the war. And again, that's my family, my grandmother in the middle, in the center with her kids. You'll see there they're 4. Eventually they're gonna be 7, so keep counting. And so the next slide, please. Okay, so this is not the altar in the exhibit, but a different one. They built 4 large altars at Heart Mountain. And this is under construction. This is called the Shibata Butsudan. And for a long time, the photo on the right is what our family knew of this. It's a studio photo that was taken in the 1940s. And it hung in my grandmother's house. And then my father took it and did a lot of research on it. And we didn't really know where it ended up. We had a little caption that said Ontario, and we thought Canada, but it's actually Ontario, Oregon. And in 2017, my father finally found out what happened to it. It wasn't a mystery to other people, but it was a mystery to him. So next slide, please. He got in touch with Reverend Candace Shibata, who was the granddaughter, of the Reverend who commissioned the altar at Heart Mountain. And he was from, my eyes are terrible. He's from White River Buddhist Church, and after he left the camps, he went to Ontario, Oregon, which was where the studio photo was taken, and then to Stockton, California. And finally, the altar ended up in Japan. And what you're seeing here at the top is lotus flower, which symbolizes pure life. And then the other photos are actually the scenes from the block where the Reverend lived in Heart Mountain. It's the north, south, east, and west views. They're carved, as I say, by the Nishiura brothers. But the artwork itself, my father thought, and I think he's right, based on the way they look, are based on drawings from my grandfather Shingo Nishiura, who was Shinzaburo's son and was a visual artist. So next slide, please. So that's Shingo there at his easel in Heart Mountain. He was born in Japan and came over after his parents had already lived in the US for a while. He lived with his grandparents until he was, I think, an adolescent. And then he studied art in San Francisco. But he also did all kinds of things. He worked construction, gardening, and various other things. But when he went to Heart Mountain, he was able to teach. So this is him, that's a WRA photo on the right of him teaching night school. And so next photo, please. This is a painting he did that is sort of an aerial view of Heart Mountain. And I'm not exactly sure if he did this just from his mind or if he actually went up and took a look, but it's kind of a striking view because you see it almost as a fantasy rather than as a real place. And then the next photos, please, next slide, please. So these are actually, backtrack a little bit, on the left, those are 2 views of, that's a relative's house. They had they worked in a nursery, according to Dad's memoir, and they had friends bring in potted plants to try to make it a little more palatable to live there. And then that's a guard scene there. And then the 2 paintings on the right are actually paintings that grandfather did from the train going from Santa Anita to Heart Mountain. So the one on the top is labeled El Paso, and the one on the bottom is labeled New Mexico. Next slide, please. And these are 4 views he did of different seasons at Heart Mountain. So you see the snow and the flowers, the birds. and the different, the changing of the light, because it was a very harsh landscape, but he was pretty fascinated by it. He was really in love with nature. And then next slide. And then, as I said, he taught life drawing. So that's one of his sketches from teaching. And he was fascinated with all the wildlife. So he did a lot of paintings of the wildflowers. And it was pretty exciting this year to get in touch with someone at Heart Mountain who's doing research on the nature and the landscape there, and who's incorporating some of these flowers into her dissertation. So, next slide. And I wanted to end with this. There's a few resources there if you're interested in learning more about the family. And as you can see now, we've got 7 kids. This is when they're back at Mountain View, California in 1949. And I wanted to especially focus on this because these are the people, more so than me, who have done the research. My father's generation really took a lot of time and a lot of care in their different ways to capture the family legacies, everything from vaccine cards to letters to receipts. My father went through every issue of the Heart Mountain Sentinel, searching for any mention of family, including what addresses they lived at and, parties they went to and things like that, lumber bills and all of that. So for me, there's the public side, buildings you can still go to like a temple, but there's also the little sketchbooks and the my father's writings and my uncle's writings and all of that to sort of capture the family, both as public and private, and the bridges between them, which is why I wanted to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. To see your family in that last slide with the 7 children makes me want to also share with you that her brother and sister are here today from Ottawa, Canada, and from New Jersey in support. And so this is really a time to tell family stories and descendants, so thank you. Next we'll have Mitch Homma, and Mitch drove up here from San Diego. He's the family historian. His great-grandparents were brought to the United States by the American Baptist Church in 1928 to open churches in Gardena for the Japanese and Japanese American community.
Hi, I'm Mitch Homma, like I said, and this is my family history story. And this first slide here are some of the key family members here. On the upper left, the wedding photo is my grandparents, Kishiro and Mitsu Wada Homma. And the upper right is Reverend Masahiko and Kuni Wada, and they were missionaries to the US here at Gardena Valley Baptist Church before the war. And the center photo here is the Homma family with the Wada family at the Homma House in Sawtelle, California. And the 2 adults in the center photo there are my grandmother's younger siblings, and Michihiko, Mike Wada, and Midori Wada. And the little boy standing in front of my grandfather is my father. Next slide, please. So of course, just in case we ran out of time, my thank you slide is up front. And I really want to thank USC and JANM for putting together programs like this. I think it's really important for our community. And, I got to make new friends here and new friends that we have a family connection to, and through the different internment camps and stuff. But back to USC, grandfather was a USC dental school graduate, and it was USC classmates that got him into photography. And the family has a fantastic collection of photos from the 1930s all over Southern California here, and of course, probably every single USC football game, since he was one of the field sports photographers, the Rose Bowls, the Olympics, and stuff like that. And grandmother also attended USC on a music scholarship, and her family was very involved in photography in Japan, which left the family in extremely vast collection of photos from all over Japan, and Japan occupied Far East, where they did their missionary work. Next slide, please. And this is my grandmother, who passed away in 2004. And this is kind of where my family research history started. After she passed away, some of my cousins and Stephanie, my wife, and I were asked to go up to Seattle and help clean up grandmother's room. And of course, we knew that the boxes in the closets were probably just full of clothes, and she was a music teacher too, so music stuff. And there was a few of that, but there were probably 18, 20 boxes just full of all their Japan documentation, from great-grandmother's childhood, all through their school records, their missionary work all over the Far East. And a few of the black and white photos down the bottom were some of my grandmother's photos that were in the album. And the photo on the bottom right there, it's probably too small to read, but it's the Morioka Baptist Kindergarten. And so we learned through this research that grandmother would attend regular Japanese school and then attend the Baptist missionary schools afterwards. Next slide, please. And we've mentioned that this project and event is related to the Sutra and Bible exhibit, and these are a couple of the family artifacts in the Sutra and Bible exhibit. The drawing on the scrap wood plank on the left is from great-grandfather in 1943 from Santa Fe Detention Center. Of course, he was a Baptist minister. And written on there is verses 1 and 2 from Psalm 121. And it's God, the help of those who seek him. So here's a Baptist minister like Gail's grandfather, arrested and sent to federal detention, and but never losing his faith. And the right there is one piece of the Amachi Memorial wood planks, and I'll talk about that in some slides coming up. And again, that's part of the Sutra and Bible exhibit, and they encourage you to please go visit it. Next slide, please. So this is my great-grandfather, who was born in Sendai. And like I said, he was a Baptist minister in Japan. He was supposed to be a diplomat. And he did get his law degree from Tokyo Imperial University, but then he became a Christian and got kicked out of the family. And so he ended up going to Yokohama Baptist Seminary instead. And a few of the photos on here, like I said, I have a vast collection of photos from Russia, Manchuria, all over different parts of China and Korea. He did a lot of missionary work. And the center photo there is his second church in Japan, which was there all the way until the 2011 tsunami wiped out the church. And of course, some of the valuable parts of the collection are the unposed candid photos, and the photos on the right are some of his missionary work, where in a lot of the towns and stuff, they weren't allowed to build churches. And so they'd have church service on the countryside and stuff. And of course, the baptism photo there, just out probably on the Sea of Japan. Next slide, please. And this is great-grandmother, and great-grandmother's father was a medical doctor who was sent by the Klan to go study in Nagasaki. And for you photo historians, you notice that cameras were introduced into Japan probably through Nagasaki. And so we think this is where his family, great-grandmother's family, got interested in photography and started their vast collection of photographs. And great-grandmother was very well educated and went to both Christian schools there in Japan, as well as her Japanese school. And she came to the US, in addition to speaking Japanese, she spoke English, French, and German fluently too. And of course, like I said, great-grandfather was supposed to be a diplomat, and she would have been the perfect diplomat's wife, speaking the different languages. And the center photo is an example of some of the unposed candid photos, and that's them playing a card game. But it's some of these unstaged candid photos that really told the family and the life they had in Japan. Next slide, please. And of course, World War II changed everything, and great-grandmother was one of the few Issei women that were arrested and sent to women's federal detention in Cedarville, Texas. And I think I recently read on the Densho website that at the time she arrived in Seagoville, Texas, there were 15 Japanese Issei women there. So she was one of the unfortunate 15 women there initially at Seagoville. And the other mugshot there is from Santa Fe Detention Center, where great-grandfather, like Gail's grandfather, went to Santa Fe, Lordsburg, and then back to Santa Fe and Crystal City. And the family's, collection of letters that they saved, of course, give the family, a really good idea of their feelings and what they went through in the private family letters. Next slide, please. And of course, I kind of spoke about this before. So my great-grandfather designed the Amachi Memorial. And it's a three-piece memorial, and the wood planks are here at Janum. They were saved from being burned in a fire by some farmers. And the granite stone in the center there is still out there at the Amachi site. And the third piece, the Gold Star Honor Roll with the names of the 31 Nisei soldiers that were killed in action from Amachi is missing. We assumed it probably got burned in the same fire that the wood planks almost got burned in. And this also kind of connects the story because in our trips back to Japan, we were able to visit many of the churches and some of the other memorials that great-grandfather and the family left around Japan in their different churches, which is also a treasure. Next slide, please. And getting to the Homma family, so there was mention of Nancy's 50 Objects project, and Uncle Homma's chair is one of the 50 objects, and there's a fantastic story there. And so the center photo there is of my grandfather and his older brother, Yorozu. And the photo on the right there is grandfather Homma, who brought his cameras to Amachi as demo equipment. So the family also has a fantastic collection of Amachi photos that were taken with the quote-unquote dental office cameras. Next slide, please. And getting back to connecting the stories, so of course, Stephanie and I got to come here not too long after Nancy Ukai helped us find the connection with the chair from Heart Mountain there. But it also connected the stories with some of the family photos we uncovered, from all these boxes. And we noticed that in a lot of the Homma family photos, they're always sitting in chairs. And so use of the family's use of chairs in Japan was just kind of a common thing to us. And the wooden box there was given to the Homma family at Amachi that Yorozu made in Heart Mountain. And it's got a sakura cherry tree on the front cover. In my next slide, I'll cover the significance of that. And of course, the photo on the right, the little stool there is my favorite gardening stool, and I still use it as a gardening stool because it's the perfect height and stuff. But that was made for the Homma boys, at Amachi, and it's been rebuilt probably about 20 times. But you'll notice the wood knot right there in the center, just like all the other chairs he made. And everyone keeps telling me I need to stop using it and preserve it, but it's the perfect Homma chair for me. Next slide, please. And again, connecting the stories. So on the back of the photo on the left with my great-grandparent Homma there was a sakura tree planted when grandfather came to the US. So we think that was the significance of the sakura tree on the box. The center photo there is the Homma children outside their barrack, 12K, 12B barracks at Amachi. And the little tree there, just off the shoulder of my Uncle Cunio there, they made by dialing in today too, is still there, and that's the color photo on the right. So in July this past year, the family got to take the journey back to Amachi, especially after, and that was kind of nice, especially after it just, the bill passed this year, authorizing it to be a part of the National Park System. And that's, my father has since passed away, but my aunt, who's the little girl in the center photo, and my dad's younger brother, who's the little kid in the center photo, and they got to go back, stand on the barracks that they lived at 80 years ago. And that same tree is still there at Amachi, not being cared for, but it's being a survivor too. Next slide, please. That's my last slide. So this was more for, since it's being recorded and people online. So I have a few hundred photos out there on Janum's Discover Nikkei website. And last photo, just some of the other Amachi artifacts that the family has. Like I said, the family, they saved everything, and I'm blessed to have an incredible collection of artifacts from the World War II years. Thank you.
So I know we're a little past time, but we're gonna sort of extend the program a little bit because we'd like to be able to ask some questions. Nancy, I'll let you take over this, but we did get one question from our Zoom audience that I thought would be an interesting one to add into the mix. So this is from Susan Yonemura, who said, "Wonderful stories from all the panelists. I wonder if any of them can speak to resources they found particularly helpful to research their family histories, particularly going back to Japan." So I just wanted to add that to the mix, but we'll let Nancy take over and lead the questions. And just so you all know, so we're gonna, it's 3:38 now, so we'll go sort of a 10, 12 minutes over time. And then once we're done here, we will have an opportunity to go into the lobby and to meet and speak to our panelists here today. So if you don't get a chance to ask a question in the large group, and if you can't stay with us, you can just stick around, and then we'll have a brief sort of opportunity to chat with everybody afterwards.
Well, thank you, Emily. And we're so fortunate that these objects, records, or artifacts have survived the war because so much was burned, buried, left behind. And then the fact that you descendants have done this research is such a gift to us. And I think what you're helping to do is gather back some of these stories and things to bring our community closer. And I think that's embodied in fact that today Mitch and Laura were meeting for the first time, and they learned that Mitch's uncle actually saw in person the Kitaji Bibles when they were both in Houston. And then Laura, I believe you said that the Nishiura brothers might have been asked or possibly built the cabins
I have heard.
at the Gilroy Yamato Hot Springs in near Watsonville. And so now we're looking for a connection between Elizabeth and Mitch, and I'm sure we'll find one.
There's probably a Heart Mountain connection there
Yes,
somewhere.
right, exactly, because you had relatives in so many camps. So let's go with Susan's question about what archives or what sources were especially important to your research. Mitch, would you like to go first, or anybody?
Sure. And so I was pretty blessed because my family is really, really easy to trace in Japan, but recently had a former retired Japan, I think she was in Japan Baptist missionary who was there for 38 years, arranged for Stepping Nai to visit Kanto Gakuen University, and had some 95-year-old pastor who personally knew the family come and talk to us. And so I've been incredibly, I'm not a genealogist or a historian or anything. I'm an aerospace engineer, and this kind of all fell into my lap. And for me, it was important because when I found all the church photos before the war, you know, I met so many, reconnected with so many families that grew up around Gardena Valley Baptist Church that had lost all their photos during the war years. They weren't able to take them to camp with them. Families that lost all their Japan photos and their Japan records because they burned them right after Pearl Harbor. And so it was tragic that both my great-grandparents were arrested at the church parsonage, but the church people went into the parsonage and packed up all their belongings and sent it to Seattle after the war. So that's why I have so many artifacts and stuff. But being able to go back to Japan and visit their churches and talk to the people who knew the families, growing up, meeting pastors both from Japan and here in the US that knew the family. So when we found all these photos, it connected all these the artifacts with all these stories I grew up with.
And of course, your family story is particularly interesting because your great-grandfather came here in 1928 when Asians were banned from coming, but they were brought by the auspices of the American Baptist Church. Elizabeth, your artifact, the one that was built in Heart Mountain for Reverend Shibata, is actually an interesting migration story because that altar is in Fukuoka, Japan, Have you been able to visit it and see it?
I have not, as I said, our family only figured out where it was in 2017. So we have a pandemic and things, but it's on my wish list to go. But in 2019, my uncle, my father's brother, was lucky enough to go with his family to Japan to see the family cemetery and the house. So he has amazing photos that are from pre-war, family photos, and now his photos today of what the cemetery looks like, the house looks like, because it's still standing, the path up to the steps. So it's pretty amazing. And one of the things I've realized just recently is I need to ask him how he figured out how to do that, because I know he went, but I don't know the story of how he traced it.
Gail talked about discovery and recovery, and it's not just recovery of the materials, of course, it's memory, and also the sense of our ancestral spirits. And I feel like they're here today with us at JANM, and thanks to USC. Laura, have you been able to go to Japan and make any connection with the Kitaji's clan there?
I did get to go to Japan in 2019 with my daughter, thanks to my daughter and her cousins. I was able to go down to Wakayama, the southern part where the family was from, not to the east coast where our family was from, but just to see the agriculture in southern Japan and the celebration of that compared to the cities. That made me understand better why so many went and became farmers here in California, very successful farmers.
Wakayama is really so beautiful. Are there any questions in the room here? Yes?
Yeah, I ran into a kind of a legal problem. I'm a trustee on a trust, and specifically, my father wrote a bunch of letters from the Tule Lake Stockade to his family at Hart Mountain, okay? And so another family member, unrelated to me, related to me distantly, has them, but won't give them back to me. So technically, I think legally they belong to me. Have you, anybody, panelists, run to that sort of problem? You seem to come from good families, but all families aren't good like yours. Most families in this world fight each other because it comes down to money.
Well,
Okay,
and part of the-
so could you give me any advice of how to retrieve those? Heard of a lawyer, a probate lawyer, or somebody like that?
We were
I think
fortunate
you-
to avoid that whole issue.
Pardon?
We were fortunate to avoid that whole
You know,
issue.
most of you, because you come from good families.
No,
You-
what
from
happened-
religious,
In 2017,
loving families, but all families aren't like yours.
we got word in 2017 that the captain's Bibles were in an auction studio.
I can't hear you. I'm hard of hearing too.
So I think we can't really offer specific legal advice because we're not a legal institution. So let me just shift. So we have just about 5 minutes left. So Laura, why don't you go ahead and share the story about how the Kitaji Bibles were discovered, because it's pretty incredible.
We were able to avoid that issue, although we were concerned that it might go into a big problem. All right. In 2017, the Bibles were in an auction studio in New York, and they were asking for an extraordinary amount for that. We were able to stop the auction, and through volunteer work from a few attorneys, the lead attorneys in the 1988 reparations.
So that's a similar type of problem, yeah.
It was similar.
Yeah, I see.
Let me tell you, a lot of faith went behind that. We made intentions for things to go smoothly, and it did resolve. But the general consensus is 98% of ownership is possession, and that person, the person who has it, unless unless you can prove the provenance, it's very, very difficult.
Well, letters have signatures and.
But
Are there
that's
other
not
questions?
necessarily, yeah.
In our audience here?
Question.
Yeah.
Let me get you.
Oh, I don't
He
need.
has a loud
yeah,
voice.
I don't need it, no, I don't need it.
Not everybody will be able to hear you, I promise.
Okay.
I have a loud voice, but it's not hard of hearing.
Okay.
Can everyone hear me now?
Yep.
It's just a simple question. You talk about the immigration, but I know there's Japanese communities in Canada and Mexico. Did it extend at all to Canada or Mexico, this journey? That's it, that's the end of my question.
Yes, there were incarceration camps in Canada. And in terms of Mexico, there were camps in Mexico too, weren't there? In Cuba, and of course in Latin America, several thousand,
They were removed and brought to the United
Were
States,
removed
as were
and-
the Peruvians.
and were brought to the United States via New Orleans and then brought to Crystal City, where they were held there as hostages to trade for American POWs in Japan. Another question?
Let's
There's
go
someone up there.
Yeah, we'll take okay, these two questions. And then,
While I have the mic, I'd just like to let you all know that our store staff have very generously set up a station where you can purchase copies of Sutra and the Bible in the lobby. So as soon as we're done here, if you'd like to get a copy and have our panelists sign for you, that will be available and just as soon as we wrap up the Q&A here.
Hello. I have a question about the sakura tree. So anyways, I swear to you, there's one at Azusa Pacific University, and it's alive and well, it's very healthy. You say it comes from Heart Mountain, right?
So
What would it be doing at a
So-
university?
in my picture, the wooden box was made by my uncle in Hart Mountain with the sakura tree etched on the front cover. And that box was brought to Amachi so my grandfather died in Amachi at the age of 44, the USC dentist. And so I never knew my grandfather Homma, and my father was 8 years old when he passed away. And so my aunt and uncle who were at Hart Mountain, of course, came down to from Hart Mountain to Amachi for the funeral services, and they brought that wooden box, and that was used for cards and coding for my grandfather's funeral. That's how it ended up in our family.
I think you mentioned Azusa Pacific University, is that right? We can look into that, but not sure about that. Is there one more question there?
one more
Thanks.
question.
Hi. So when you were gathering these stories, did you ever imagine that you would be able to share it on a platform like this? And how does it feel to be here today?
I know, for me, gathering all the photos and documents, the number one thing I wanted to do was be able to share it with my cousins, right? I didn't think it was fair that I ended up with all the photos and documents and stuff, and that's why, and when we're out there later, I can show you the 100-page photo book that I put together for all the family and the cousins that kind of document my great-grandparents and grandparents and the Homma family's journey from, the late 1890s all the way until, recent history. And so I never thought I would be at a forum like this, and a lot of it was just, these are just personal family stories. And but I think that, and I was telling Nancy this last night, for me, the JANM conference in 2008, where, I got to meet so many of the church families that have had nothing, right? They have, their family history was lost in the forced evacuation. All the Japan stuff was lost. And so I knew right after I took care of the immediate family research and documenting that I was gonna seek help from the American Baptist, and I'm on the board of managers for the American Baptist Historical Society. but to try and bring some of that church history, not only to the other Baptist families that lost everything, but many of the Japanese Baptist churches in Japan were firebombed, when they firebombed cities, and a lot of those churches back there had missing records or holes in their records, and I have the baptism records on some of the churches that great-grandfather built. I have the blueprints and the land deeds and stuff like that. And so even our family in Japan, I brought parts of the family tree in Koseki back to Japan. And with the privacy laws there in Japan and stuff, some of that stuff is very difficult for them to get. And in turn, I've gotten a wealth of information from Japan. I mean, your Koseki started, in like the 1600s or something, but some of the family members provided stuff back, to the 11th century, stuff like that, and so.
Laura or Elizabeth, would you like to comment?
The captain's dream was that his Bible would be shared by others, and he had my oldest sister promise she would get it published. When I had them photocopied or digitized, there were 4,000 pages. Not something we're going to publish. It is available online, however, if you go through Stanford Archives, they have PDF copies of it. So that's where we feel that we are fulfilling his wish.
I would say that.
Yeah, in very unexpected ways, and even this is part of that.
And I think that being able to gather here at Janum and connect not only through these stories, but the artifacts, and actually 50 Objects wanted to do a story about the Shibata Butsudan, the Nishiura Butsudan that went to Japan, and I've been able to meet you in person.
Yeah.
I know Reverend Shibata, and then, Mitch and Laura, your stories are already, yeah, so thank you very much, and I do hope you all can go see the Sutra and Bible exhibition if you haven't already. And Gail, thank you very much for all of your work to connect us and make your grandfather's story all of our story. So thank you very much.
So, thank you.
So thank you again, everybody, for joining us for this program. So if you can stick around, we're just going to move into the lobby. So please stay and purchase a copy of Sutra and Bible. If you're a museum member, you get 10% off. And we're here, available to sign copies and to talk to you more about these experiences. So thank you all very much.